Oh, they're really coming in. 50 people already.
Good.
All right, Joe, you ready to go?
Let's roll. Yep.
All right, sounds good. All right, hello everybody, and welcome to our second conversation in transportation in 2023. It's the third year we're doing this. This is our 14th session overall, and we're really excited for this one. This one is really going to be great. Thanks to everybody, not just from Nick's site, but also if you're tuning in based on the advertisement through the Southern District, welcome. We hope that you'll tune in for some future sessions in the conversation series as well. Just a couple of reminders. First off, my name is Andy Wagner. I'm with North Carolina ITE. I work in Raleigh at HNTB. A couple of announcements before we get started. First off, you'll receive after the session sometime this afternoon or tomorrow morning a link to your PDH form for the session as well as the evaluation form. Again, you can fill out the evaluation online. There'll be a link, or you can fill out the PDF and send it to the secretary at the email address that's on there. Second, this is an active participation event, as they all are. Most of you who have been to one of these before know what I'm going to tell you, and that is if you have questions at any time, not just during the Q&A, you can put those in the Q&A function here in Zoom. If you look down, I'm not sure it's where it's located for you, but for me, it's at the bottom of the screen. It says Q&A. You can type your question in there. That helps us track which questions we've answered and which ones we haven't. We'll start answering questions from all the viewers at about 12:45. Again, with about 15 minutes left. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Hummer.
Thanks, Andy. And let me add my welcome to everybody. Really appreciate your joining. Got a great crowd here today. Thanks to the Strategic Initiative Council and the Young Members Council for being our sponsors of this series. Thank you to the Nixite Diamond and Gold sponsor companies who make this possible. We really appreciate your support. And like Andy said, please don't hesitate. Type in your questions into the Q&A box when you have them, and we'll get to them toward the end of the hour. Our guest today, we're very pleased to welcome Steve Polzin, a research professor at Arizona State University, School of Sustainable Engineering and the Built Environment. In early 21, Steve completed an appointment as a senior advisor for research and technology in the Office of the Assistant Secretary for Research and Technology at the US DOT. Previously, he was director of mobility policy research at the Center for Urban Transportation Research at the University of South Florida. And prior positions include working at transit agencies in Chicago, Cleveland, and Dallas. He served on the board of directors for the Hillsborough Area Rapid Regional Transit Authority and on the Hillsborough County MPO board. Dr. Polzin has a BSCE from University of Wisconsin-Madison and master's and PhD degrees in civil engineering with focus on transportation from Northwestern University. So Steve, thanks so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Well, thank you. I look forward to it. It's an interesting topic, and I look forward to both your questions and the questions of the participants.
Absolutely. Most of us are here today are not transportation planners. Maybe we've heard of this thing called induced demand, but not quite sure what it is and whether we should be scared of it or not. So start out with a basic definition. What is induced demand?
Okay, well, induced demand has gotten a fair amount of attention lately. It's an old economic theory that started in the 60s when people understood the functioning of freeways and delay and volume and capacity, and really took off in about 1982 when there was some work done that talked about the relationship of adding capacity and the fact that it may induce new demand. That concept is a fundamental economic concept. It basically says if you lower the price of something, people tend to consume more of it. And when we travel, we spend time and money, and it's obviously the time piece that is impacted by roadway capacity and congestion. So if congestion's relieved with new capacity, it gets cheaper. And the argument and logic being is that then that's going to induce more people to travel because it's in effect more affordable from a time perspective. That's kind of the foundational theory. The theory is certainly logical and makes sense. It's common sense and wisdom, but there's an awful lot of nuance and details and aspects of it that really impact its relevance for transportation.
So where do these induced travelers come from?
There's really, and this is really a critical question, perhaps one of the most critical, because it leads to an awful lot of confusion. At the one extreme, some folks see a new road go in and look at it 2 or 3 or 4 years later and say it's back to where it was. It's busier. Look at all that new traffic that filled up that capacity, and that's, quote, all induced demand. If you really want to understand what's going on, you need to parse through that and look at really all of the components of new traffic or traffic that may now be on that road. And I'll kind of walk through those a little bit. One piece of that traffic is traffic that previously was on roads, but different roads because that road was too congested. So those folks were either weaving through neighborhoods or perhaps taking a circuitous route on a less congested roadway because that road was full. So those people are geographically induced back into this corridor when new capacity is available. A second component of the demand is folks that make a shift in their temporal travel. You don't travel during the rush periods because it's too congested, so you travel in the off-peak. And if you've got discretionary time, you might travel in the evenings, etc. But when that road or facility has new capacity, you might then take advantage and say, well, you know, it's more convenient to do it during the rush hour, and now the road's got more capacity, so I'll shift my temporally shift back into that corridor. The third component of demand is really where there's redistribution of activities within that corridor, perhaps from other places in the region. It's not uncommon when major facilities expanded that there's going to be new development to take advantage of that new capacity. Those might have been trips that were to other places in the community, but there's simply redistribution of destinations and even residential to take advantage of the new capacity. A fourth group that's critical and a really important one is simply pure growth in the region. My first interest in
Steve, I kind of lost your audio there a bit.
Yeah, I'm having trouble hearing him as well, Joe.
Still hearing me okay?
Yeah, I can still hear you fine.
Okay.
Yeah, that might help. Stand by. We'll give Steve a second to get his headset situated.
In the
Should be
meantime,
fine.
for those just joining, I want to say again, thanks for joining us today. We really appreciate it. And if you have questions along the way, tap them into the Q&A function, and toward the end of the hour, we'll have time to get to some of those anyway, and get your questions answered. Steve will answer those.
I don't know why we're doing that.
Steve, your audio is coming back.
Yeah, I think we're getting you now, Steve.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Oh,
Yes.
okay, great. Let me
Excellent.
pick back up then and turn my other camera on here.
It's all right. We still live in a world where
Yeah, no, that's okay. Anyway, the third area is that growth in regional population. I was referring to Austin, Texas, where there was a argument that new capacity would be absorbed by induced demand. And it was a region that had been growing about 3% per year for a decade. And so obviously, the areas that are growing have new capacity needs simply based on population and employment growth. And when you particularly look at places like Florida and Texas and Arizona, the Carolinas, some of those places that are seeing rapid growth, obviously that's creating substantial new demand for transportation that needs to be followed. Having said that, I do think it's important that people recognize that the demand growth from population is dramatically different than it's historically been. We've got a number of states that are declining in population. A number of major metro areas are declining in population. And about somewhere between a third and a half of all of the counties in the country are declining in population. The country as a whole has reached its slowest growth rate in our memories, in our lifetimes recently. So we don't have that same level of kind of population filling up all new capacity in all locations. Having said that, places like Florida are growing rapidly, and that creates a lot of additional demand. One of the examples I gave of that is just in 2022, 65,000 New Yorkers turned in their driver's licenses for Florida driver's licenses. And at the national level, there's about 163 linear feet of lane miles per capita. And so you move all those people to Florida, and that's 1,600 lane miles just to make up for 1 year's worth of growth from one state. So it gives you some sense of the capacity needs of the system to accommodate demand. So that's kind of the fourth thing. The fifth major area where you can see some induced demand is potentially shifting from other modes of travel. And arguably, you're not going to have too many people shifting from bike and walk, but you may have people shifting from public transportation or sharing a ride to driving alone. And historically, those were non-trivial factors, but more recently, we're in a situation where the share of travel on those modes is so modest that there's simply not that many more people to shift. And to give that a little context, back when they first started keeping data in 1960, about 20% of people shared rides in commuting. Pre-COVID, it was down to about 9% that were carpooling, and it's dropped even more. It's closer to 8% right now. Similarly, if you go back several decades, we had 10% of people commuting to work on transit. Pre-COVID, that was fairly stable at about 5%. The most recent data says it's about 2.5%. So those markets are simply, in most instances, simply not large enough to provide a lot of new demand for new facilities. The sixth category, and the one that I truly think of as induced demand, is where somebody is motivated because it's more convenient and faster to make additional trips and or travel further. So it's either they're increasing their trip generation or changing their trip distribution and their average trip length. And once in a while, when you hear discussions of induced demand, it's really important to kind of tease out what all components of change are they looking at, and which ones are they measuring or defining as induced demand. Those in my perspective I think of as truly induced demand as opposed to redistributed travel demand. And those are real, and anybody can relate to it a little bit, where you know, you might be willing to commute a little further to work if there's less congestion on the road, or drive a little further to take advantage of a different store or a sales further away if there's less congestion, or maybe even be induced to take an additional trip that you might have otherwise sat on the couch and said, no, I'm not going to bother, and do that now. So those are really the components of induced demand. And again, you will see different definitions and interpretations of that. And one of the kind of troubling aspects of this temptation to take this discussion to the general public is it's complex enough that you need to be a little bit careful when you're dealing with a lay population and decision makers, so that everybody's kind of using the same definition and understanding what they're referring to.
Good. Thanks, Steve. Your camera's not on. I don't want you to mess up the audio.
Yeah, let me
Coming in great, but if you can get the camera on and keep the good audio, that would be.
Yep. I'll tweak it while we continue here.
There's a lobbying group that has published a so-called induced demand calculator, and as far as I can tell, it's pretty much a linear, their model, a linear relationship with lane miles. And I think your point is it's a little bit more subtle than that.
Yeah, and I think that gives a good example, because as you know, the fundamental theory is really based on travel time savings. So while lane miles is a surrogate for time savings, you know, the kind of the example I use to give context sometimes is if you've got a road that's operating at level of service A and you happen to add lanes to it, there's no logical argument that you would induce additional demand, because you're not speeding travel up for anybody. So that concept just doesn't make logical sense to people in that sense. So yes, you do need to be very careful about the context. The calculator that you referenced, it has some caveats in it, and it specifically suggested that, you know, this isn't useful for project level analysis, but then they used a project level scenario to exemplify it. So you need to be a little careful with that. As we'll see as we move through some of these discussion, context really matters a lot. I've alluded to that already in terms of some of the population growth and other characteristics, but it's contextually important enough to really understand it. And you know, the scenario and induced demand is discussed in the context of lane miles, but as traffic engineers know, there's a lot more to capacity than lane miles. There's signalization and traffic flow and weaving characteristics and signalization characteristics, topography, a whole host of other factors influence flows and volumes, and those are all relevant and context characteristics that are important.
Having said that, I'm going to ask you to generalize again and give us some idea of the overall magnitude, all these 6 factors that you mentioned kind of wrapped up into one. You know, if I do a project and I add 50% to the road capacity, or let's make it even easier math, 100% to the road capacity, induced demand is not going to add 100% to the existing demand, right? What's the sort of ballpark magnitude?
You wouldn't think so. And yet some of the calculators and some of the scenarios and some of the research suggests that that you would in fact see that level of induced demand. But no, the numbers range depending on the studies and the time frame during which the research was carried out. Some of the earliest work showed a 0.9%, meaning a 1% or 100% increase in capacity would be a 90% increase in volume. Some follow-up work showed 40% numbers. And there's a real range, and as we continue the discussion, I have argued, in fact, one of my foundational arguments in challenging the industry, particularly the research industry as well, is we're in a little different point right now in terms of changes in travel behavior, and to rely on data that most of which was collected literally in the last century or early this century, and then extrapolating that into the future when the context is so different is inappropriate at best. And so that's really a critical challenge. A lot of the data that people are relying on is dated and not reflective of current conditions.
So for the researchers listening to us, I thought I heard a problem statement lurking there.
Yes, and at least a few folks have been following some of the discussion and the literature, and there have been some expressions of interest in going back in and looking at some of these factors in the context of today's world. And let me elaborate on that a little bit. I published a piece of work in 2006 for FHWA that referenced the changes in travel that were occurring at the time, and argued that we're in a little different era than we were, and that we're going to see some plateauing of per capita travel demand growth. If you go back into the last century, per capita travel was growing at a couple % a year, and we were going through an age with a lot of suburbanization, spouses joining the workforce, car ownership ramping up with multiple cars per household, working spouses, meaning trips for food and shuttling kids and running errands, etc. You were doing less things at home and purchasing services, etc. Auto ownership was growing, transit and shared ride use were declining. Suburbanization was kind of full speed ahead at that era. And yes, travel demand growth was growing rapidly. In about 2005, per capita travel peaked, and it hasn't hit that level since. In other words, the average individuals traveling about the same number of VMT as they were in 2005. And arguably, there's reasons to suspect that not only will that not increase, it may continue to decrease going forward. There's a number of phenomenon, particularly the communication substitution for travel effects, perhaps some environmental sensitivity, some other things that will dampen some of that tendency to grow travel demand as fast as has been the case in the past.
Here we are, 130 people listening to this who did not have to travel to a hotel ballroom somewhere to enjoy this. So
yeah,
well done. Induced demand does not happen instantaneously after we cut the ribbon, right? It takes a while for those 6 factors to kick in.
Yeah, and different folks will, and this is common with elasticities, they'll have a short-term and a long-term elasticities as the market reacts and responds. And again, that's another consideration that folks should pay attention to. Obviously, a longer time duration allows more of the kind of the pure growth and redistribution effects to take place. Some of the more immediate effects might be that additional trip trip length and or trip generation might occur relatively quickly. And in fact, arguably, as new growth replaces capacity on the road, that may dampen some of those induced trips otherwise as well.
Good point. Put those ones back in the bottle. Yeah.
Yeah.
In your experience, do transportation planners across the U.S. generally try to estimate induced demand before a project, and do they do a good job of it?
You know, I think the story is very mixed on that. Implicitly, some of our planning processes and tools integrate at least some aspects of that. Normal traditional regional travel modeling would certainly capture the population and development growth. If your land use scenarios were well thought through and careful, you would capture some of that, potentially some of that redistribution effect of land use. Your path building, your trip assignment, or your path building, trip distribution rather, would reflect in a modeling analysis, would reflect a redistribution of geography of the trips. To some extent, if you've got a sophisticated model, you may even have some of that temporal redistribution captured in an activity-based modeling framework. And similarly, the math within an activity-based modeling framework will capture some trip generation effects. Some of the experts argue as to the degree of sensitivity of that. But yes, a lot of analysis can capture that. Now, having said that, people need to be careful and make sure that the scenarios that they're testing and those kinds of things are reasonable. And some of the pushback has been that, well, you know, the planners are always using optimistic scenarios and predicting growth that may or may not occur. And we need to be careful about that. And I was actually early pointing that out when I was forecasting changes in per capita travel. And there are some funny situations, like I'm sure there were not too many planners 10 years ago in California that would have pictured the state of California losing population for 3 years in a row now. And so you do need to run scenarios. You do need to pay attention to some of the trends and some of what's going on. But yes, the planning tools can capture some of that sensitivity within the frameworks of the modeling. And a good modeler can do some scenarios like, you know, run the new network with the old demographics and see what that does, for example, and start to tease out some of the effects through some scenario testing.
Our custom in North Carolina is at least to run a model with the build condition in the design year and the no build condition. So I'm not a planner, but my feeling is that kind of sounds like it's trying to capture most of those effects.
Yeah, it's certainly, you know, it's certainly a good tactic. And like I said, even the land use redistribution, you can do some scenarios to see how within the corridors, for example. Another thing that we've not specifically mentioned, but kind of alluded to, is this whole issue of what's the scale of measurement. If you measure changes on a facility, it's one thing. If you measure it at the corridor, it might be something else. And if you measure new traffic at the regional level, it could be something different still, because obviously traffic is a system and the flows redistribute, et cetera. So when you're measuring things and talking about induced demand, you need to have a sensitivity to what scale, what level you're talking about.
Good. Yeah, thanks. We got a couple of questions popping up in the Q&A. That's fantastic. If there's others that people have, please put them in there. And like I said, we'll get to at least some of those a little bit later in the hour. Thanks for those. I'm looking down the list of your six things, the components of induced demand, and thinking from a policy point of view, some of those aren't bad things. I'm from Detroit, where we got tumbleweeds rolling down the main streets, right? We want growth up there. So, am I wrong in looking at it that way?
No, and that was really when I pushed back in a Planetson publication on induced demand. I really kind of tried to reemphasize that, historically, transportation professionals have been public servants meeting the needs of the population, the needs and the wants of the public. And good mobility is virtuous in a lot of respects. I mean, and some examples of that are, it helps emergency vehicles get where they need to get on time. It helps the first mile, last mile trip distribution, products delivery be handled productively, and that's important. It can pull traffic out of neighborhoods and put them on higher functional class facilities that tend to be safer, probably more energy efficient, less circuitous trips by putting them on higher class facilities. If you're an individual or a business, the whole idea of having greater accessibility is fundamental to our understanding of both the productivity of the economy. For example, if you're an employer, your work pool, your talent base is bigger because more people are accessible to you as an employer. More customers are accessible to you as an employer. If you're a consumer, more product choices are accessible to you as a consumer. So we can't forget all of the positive benefits of mobility that we've historically aspired to when we think of adding new capacity. If you don't have that capacity, it can stymie some of those things. There was just within the past few months, a piece in the Wall Street Journal arguing that if rapidly growing areas don't expand transportation capacity, it'll stifle and dampen that growth. And that's very true. So yes, mobility is an asset. It's virtuous. It's historically been one of the top goals of transportation agencies at all levels of government. Yes, hopefully that that's something that we continue to aspire to, but it's important to understand there's a fairly strong constituency of folks that envision mobility as bad, not because they don't like mobility, but because they're nervous about the environmental consequences of both the disruption and the climatic impacts. So they're very nuanced about their advocacy for mobility because of that. So there's definitely some tension in the profession right now.
And yeah, urban sprawl is a real thing, and probably generally overall negative for the environment in a lot of ways. So to the extent that some of this induced demand is that sprawl, it would make sense to try to estimate that and then make policy decision to mitigate it somehow, right?
Yeah, and one thing that for throughout my career, I paid a little bit of attention to this, doing a lot of work on the transit side, is if we as governmental entities want to influence land use, certainly transportation is important in that, but it's a very weak tool to try and influence land use. If you want to influence land use, you need to do it in much more connected and significant policies and tools to do it. Expecting to be able to do it just with transportation is not going to be a very productive pursuit.
And we might say the same about the global warming aspects. Certainly, autos and trucks emit a lot of carbon, contributes a lot to global warming, but it's difficult to make a big dent in that through the kind of projects we're talking about?
That's an area that's getting lots of attention right now. Transportation's at 29% of domestic greenhouse gas emissions. U.S. greenhouse gas emissions are about 14% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Almost everything is de minimis, and yet the collective sum of the things obviously add up. So it's a very legitimate thing to worry about. but again, at what cost in terms of mobility? And there's obviously subsequent economic implications and feedback from that as well. So we just need to be careful. Certainly being sensitive to environmental concerns is appropriate, but to stifle travel or pretend that we can effectively shift it to carbon-free modes isn't necessarily realistic. I tend to be a big believer in the technology-based solutions to enabling the mobility without, don't stifle the mobility, but clean it up as best we can is what's important. And we should price things appropriately as well.
I want to try to formulate this question well. When we add transit capacity, we have a chance to induce auto trips.
Yes, and that was something that I'd pointed out. Anything we do to improve traffic flow, from travel demand management to signalization to transit investments, that arguably takes traffic off the roadway, and implicitly is going to induce more travel. That's just, if you apply that theory, you need to apply it consistently across modes. In theory, if you take put people on a bus, those and take them out of cars, they're going to free up highway capacity, and that's going to induce more car trips. And so, yes, people need to be kind of honest and objective when they do their analyses and look at that. Same thing with sprawl. Radial freeways to distant suburbs can induce sprawl, but radial rail lines to distant suburbs that are highly subsidized can induce sprawl as well. And so we just need to be kind of objective and honest when we evaluate these things.
Yeah, good. So why, to say induced demand, there's a hype about it, it might be too strong, but there's certainly been a surge of stories over the last couple of years. At least some of us have noticed those. So why the hype?
I think a fair amount of, one, it is a legitimate issue, and people do need to understand it and understand the implications. But the kind of renaissance of interest in it the last few years has mostly come, at least in my opinion, because of the sensitivity to climate change. It's used as a tool to discredit roadway capacity expansion and to arguably advocate for putting that investment into public transit instead. And that's really a big piece of that. And to some extent, in addition to favoring transit, is to argue for land use controls, 15-minute cities, denser developments, those kinds of things as means to reduce overall travel demand by virtue of increasing densities and development intensiveness.
So you've written and published, I've read several of your essays to sort of counter the points made in the articles that are doing what I'm calling the hype here. But what else can we do as a profession to bring back maybe more balance to the discussion?
Well, I think the one, I think it's important that there be balance, and I think that's kind of a multifaceted challenge. One is to really understand the elements of new demand on roadways and communicate that to people. The second one is to point out the virtues of mobility, why we're doing it, to make those supply chains work, to get people to jobs on time, to get emergency vehicles where they need to go, to get traffic on the right functional class of roads. Those are all real important things, and they're compelling arguments that the lay public understands. And so we need to reinforce that and make sure people understand and appreciate that. The profession are public servants, and we're here to do the public's will, but the public has historically supported mobility, and we need to be sensitive to that. We don't need to put a stake one way or the other. I do get a little bit nervous that the profession has really shifted from servants to perceptions of saviors, that we're going to somehow save the world, and we need to be careful about that and balance that. We need to obviously educate decision makers and the public, but we also need to serve their wills and their interest as well.
And a final question on induced demand, and then I'm going to ask a couple on the other topics we have here.
Sure.
As you look around the U.S., is there any agency or state that you think is really handling the induced demand discussion particularly well? Somebody that the rest of us should maybe look to and model ourselves after?
I think that's emerging. I think the folks in Texas have understood it, and done a lot of research on it, at the Texas Transportation Institute folks, and they've looked at some of those relationships between new capacity and new demand, and people need to recognize that as an industry, we have not been increasing lane miles as fast as travel demand for decades. We've gotten, in effect, further behind the curve. The good news is our facilities are more highly utilized, making them more productive assets, but we certainly haven't kept up. The theory that you can't build your way out of congestion is just a theory because nobody's tested it. Very few places have actually added capacity in proportion to increases in economic activity and population. Those that have do show a stabilization in congestion and in travel demand. And so there's not this inevitability of congestion. I once argued that, if capacity induced demand, we wouldn't have any roads that weren't full. And so again, it's context matters.
Our in North Carolina, our most fervent hope is to not become Atlanta. So
Yeah,
we're going to try to stay at that certain level there.
yeah.
Briefly here on the travel behavior with COVID, that I know you've got some interest and some experience with that. Looks to me like the big change has been work from home. That the big change is going to last. Do you agree? Or am I missing another big one?
Certainly, telework or working from home is the dramatically significant change, and historically travel behavior changes are very modest and literally occur over decades, in fractions of a percent change in modes and trip lengths and those kinds of things. Historically they've been very stable. That was not the case when COVID hit. We went from somewhere in the 6% range of people working at home to well over 20 to 30% range. And it's been far more resilient than folks had expected. Most of the estimates show us still having somewhere in the 20 to 25% of people on an average day work at home. It's ticking down a little bit. There's increasing discussion of, long-term productivity and social relationships and business assimilation of new employees and mentoring and aspects that people are paying attention to, the productivity, et cetera. But I think across the discipline spectrums, people have come to recognize that there's tremendous benefits to both individuals and businesses associated with working at home. It's very desirable, and there's going to continue to be a significant level of working at home, probably in the 15 to 25% range. And workplaces are adjusting and accommodating. They'll come up with mechanisms and tools to make sure that the productivity and performance monitoring work, and to make sure the social relationships work. Hybrid is obviously a piece of that. But it really gives a tremendous amount of flexibility, and people aren't just all or nothing. I mean, there's the hybrid pattern, but there's even shifts within the day. There's people that'll work at home in the morning, do emails and do a bunch of things, and then go in the afternoon for meetings, or vice versa. And so it really gives an awful lot of business flexibility, and commuting. That change in commuting is somewhere in the 2 to 4% of total VMT. Just the foregone commuting alone. It tended to be longer trips. It hurt transit particularly severely, because a lot of those long distance white collar trips to central business districts were in some of the big transit markets, the San Franciscos, New Yorks, Washington, Chicago, etc., Seattle, and it hurt those transit markets particularly severely. But that is persistent, it is significant, and it's going to have a market effect on transportation going forward. And people planning corridors that were congested because of work trips need to scratch their head and pull their pencils out and spend some time and understand if they've lost a lot of white collar workers that aren't going to be back on the network in the near term. They need to understand that the pre-COVID plans don't make sense in some cases, particularly for those work trip commute situations. The other things that are significant is distance learning and the move towards enhanced capabilities and virtual connections are really going far beyond work trips. If you go in any bank anymore, and most people don't, the cashier windows are reduced to 1 or 2. People don't do banking anymore. And you're seeing everything from, distance learning to online church services, telemedicine. I helped my daughter and a friend, 2 different people, buy homes completely online, do closing online with security cameras over the internet to verify identities, etc. So we're going to see more and more of that, and secure document transmittal and those kinds of things. And that's going to cut travel demand. Trip generation rates have been declining for a couple decades. And I think they're likely to continue to decline. The challenge we may have is the predictable trips of work and banking, and some of those that we understood are going away. And it's the social recreation trips that are increasing as baby boomers move to retirement, etc. Those have different temporal patterns, different geographic patterns, and different transportation needs as well. They're not conducive to public transit as much, and so there's some other characteristics of those that we need to be sensitive to in planning. So I think we're going to continue to see repercussions from that. On the long distance trips, we're seeing some renaissance in the air side now, and that's taking traffic off the roads to some extent. Regional airlines have really democratized air travel for long distance trips, and about 6% or 6 miles of air travel can replace, or 6% increase in air traffic can replace about 1% of roadway VMT. So we're starting to see some penetration from that end of the market as well. And maybe, e-bikes and scooters and pod cars and some of those things at the short trip end as well, I see in the near future is starting to have an impact. Those are more modest in scale, but nonetheless starting to appear.
Excellent. Thanks, Steve. Let's get to some questions that appeared in the Q&A. We got a good number here. Thank you for those. Our reigning champion, Ed Johnson, finds it helpful to think about induced travel demand in terms of a water distribution system, where travel demand is the water in the system. Roadway is, of course, the pipe network, and the act of adding more pipes or replacing with larger ones does not create more water in the system, only more capacity to handle the water. Do you like his analogy?
There's some elements of it that certainly make it an appropriate analogy. Yeah.
Good. Thanks, Ed. My friend David Hyder asked about Monte Carlo simulations as a tool to do that kind of modeling of the real subtle aspects we're talking about.
Yeah, I would characterize, I mean, certainly you could do that, but just some basic scenario testing will help you hone in on, what in fact is happening in terms of the fundamental trip generation, trip distribution, mode choice, those kinds of things. You can pull that out with some scenario tests.
Good. David also asked, and this is on my list of questions too, do we get the reverse of induced demand if we reduce roadway capacity? Travel goes away. He cites the particular case of Hillsborough Street in Raleigh where that apparently happened, although maybe those trips got shoved to other routes, but maybe some of those trips disappeared too. So the reverse is true too, right?
Yeah, there's certainly, an interest in what were called road diets and those kinds of things. A lot of that is the hope, and those tend to be more for local trips. And oftentimes the desire is to push those to bike, walk, or transit. And they can, in fact, in certain contexts, be effective in doing that. But in general, if we choose to let our roads get congested or eliminate capacity at some point, yes, that will dampen travel demand. But with that dampened demand comes, for example, less commercial activity for the retailers that are on that road, et cetera. So you need to be careful.
Nico and Chattanooga, I think, is basically agreeing with your point. Transportation capacity can come in many forms. Besides additional lanes, more street connectivity. I think you mentioned even signal timing, and there's lots of ways to add capacity besides additional lanes.
Oh, absolutely. A lot of the bottleneck work, the turning lanes, those kinds of things, signalization, timing, all of those can influence throughput and hence have some impact in terms of induced demand.
Yep. Good. Long question from Russ here, getting down to the end of it. How can the principles of induced demand be applied to quantifying changes in travel behavior in response to congestion?
There's some work being done on that. There was a presentation by Alex Anas at a conference last December where he did a fairly sophisticated kind of theoretical analysis of the relationship between congestion and induced demand, and tested that with a variety of scenarios of induced demand levels, and came up with a fairly compelling theoretical proof that new capacity does generate traffic, but it doesn't worsen congestion. Congestion doesn't, is improved, and there's a natural equilibrium there. It would quit inducing demand if congestion wasn't improved. So in theory, you're obviously getting some congestion improvement. And that was with relatively high levels of induced demand. If you've got more modest levels, which I would argue is probably the case now with 2023 type data, then I think you'd see a much more positive scenario. I might note on doing some of those analyses that if you're studying induced demand, you look back to find something that was implemented perhaps 5 or 10 years ago, and then you collect the data and then you do the study. So behaviorally things, it's 10 or 15 years old by the time you get the results back. So you need to be sensitive, especially when we're going through the kinds of changes in travel behavior that we've seen recently.
One big pandemic later, yeah, who can be?
Yeah.
I'm going to skip down to the last question in our list here because I think it's related to what you're just saying. The idea of 24-hour capacity that in the scenario that I read in some of the articles is somebody opens up new freeway capacity within 4 or 5 years, the peak hours back to being congested again. ooh, we declare the project a failure, but what about on a 24-hour basis? We might have freed up space in some of the other non-peak hours, right?
Right. And as a kind of a nuance to that discussion of the temporal distribution of demand, we are in a little bit of a challenging box here with telecommute with, we used to do most of our analysis kind of weekday, weekend kind of classification, and you were amortizing investments in peak capacity over 5 days a week, whether that's transit or roadways. If we stop and think about, well, we're going to amortize this investment over 3 days a week because Mondays and Fridays, we don't really need the same capacity, that you might get a different answer in your decision-making framework. It might not be worth the same dollars of investment if that new capacity isn't going to be utilized, but 6 hours a week. And that, like I say, that applies to across the modes. So the world is changing and we need to think through those kinds of nuances.
In North Carolina, we face that in our vacation areas where the only travel that matters is 3 months a year and Friday and Sunday.
Yep. Florida has a lot of the same seasonal and holiday trends.
Yeah. Finally, Colin asked about retail shopping trips and shifting to e-commerce. That certainly has been big. That was coming on well before COVID, but probably COVID accelerated that trend, right?
Yeah, we're seeing one of the fastest growth areas has been that commercial and service travel. I mentioned per capita travel has declined. Freight has been relatively steady, but some of the growth that remains has been in the commercial and service travel. And some of that household travel is really being pushed off into commercial and service travel. If you ordered something to be delivered instead of driving out and picking up your groceries, which a fair number of people are doing now, you're not traveling, but somebody else is instead. And we're seeing a fair amount of that. And that has implications as well, as do these trends to just-in-time delivery, where you don't get the logistics efficiency of a full route of deliveries, but you get a lot of EMT per delivery. So there's some other things going on that are going to influence supply and demand going forward.
Great. We got just a couple minutes left. A few words on demand for public transportation. You mentioned before a long-term decline in these percent of commuters on public transportation. Is that starting to stabilize or reverse, or is it?
It's, the agencies have picked back up demand a little bit, some fairly substantially, depending on their markets. Those markets that were dependent on white collar, long distance commuters to information jobs are still struggling mightily. And unfortunately, those tend to be some of the top dozen transit agencies in the country, the Seattles and San Franciscos and Washington, DCs and Chicago's and New York's. Those areas are still hurting. They tend to be hurting a little more on the rail side because that tended to serve those long distance white collar commuters more. And they're, most of them, recognizing it's going to be multiple years to really sort through this and understand what it means. And the bus side, particularly those folks serving folks that don't have alternatives, what we sometimes call captive riders, those have bounced back post-COVID. But there's still, the communication substitution affects more than just work trips, and that's going to have an impact. Travel volumes aren't robust, and transit's got some very real challenges, financial and otherwise. It's not a particularly scalable industry, so they're struggling with how to scale costs to match the new demand without hurting the service quality for the rest of the passengers. And it's I wish I could solve it for them, but it's a tough one.
we got 1 minute left and a great question just came in. We'll
Sure.
wrap up with this from Andrea at KCA. What credible resources, studies, et cetera, would you recommend to learn more about induced demand? Is there
Okay.
one paper out there?
Sure. My work that I've done, both on Planetson and the stuff that's published by Reason Foundation has a number of links. There's a number of other links. Todd Littman has both critiqued my work and done a lot of work on his own, but has got a good bibliography with his piece of work. There's a fair amount out there. My criticism of most of it is it's probably true, but it's dated and the world's changed and it needs to be updated. And so that's kind of the caveat I would offer. But you'll find plenty of stuff out there, both in the research literature and also in kind of contemporary media that talks about the subject.
Fantastic. Steve, really appreciate it. Again, I had a couple more hours worth of questions here.
we could go on. The changes in travel behavior are pretty dramatic. We're at a really unique time. It's an exciting time for transportation professionals. It really is. There's no shortage of problems out there to address. So good luck. And if I can help, don't hesitate for folks to drop me a note, and we'll see what we can do and steer them towards resources, etc. Thanks for the forum, and glad everybody took the time to attend.
Absolutely. Thank you to all of our attendees, and again to our sponsors, those who put in questions. Andy, back to you. Thanks much.
All right, thanks everybody. Again, really appreciate everybody coming out. I think we had a record turnout if my numbers were right, so that's really exciting. Again, if you have any suggestions, my email is right here on the slide, and you should expect to receive your PDH and evaluation forms either this afternoon or tomorrow morning. Again, thank you very much for attending. We'll have another one of these in June. We will announce a date, topic, and guest when we schedule it.
In the meantime, keep talking transportation.
Thanks.